Well, again, welcome to My Therapist Sez and Dr. David Levy. We're so happy to have you this evening, a wonderful surgeon, medical doctor, of course, and author, and a great man. I was trying to share with some people in my introduction that when you and I have spoken over the phone, I don't know that I have many friends that will stop in the middle of it and say, hey Don, how about if we just stop and have a word of prayer? And so we'll stop in the conversation, and you'll pray over me, and then I have the privilege of praying for us and perhaps over you. And it's been a privilege to know you these years. And also I know you've spoken here before and been on My Therapist Sez previous time. And so we're so glad that you're here with us. Dr. Levy, would you please welcome Dr. David Levy?
Wow. Thank you. It is it's a privilege to be asked to speak on prayer and the brain. To speak on the changes that occur in your brain through prayer, we're going to have to first talk about the brain and then about prayer. So let's start talking about the brain and how the brain changes. So the brain is the most complex structure on planet Earth. 80 billion neurons, and with all their trillions of connections, more than any other biological or man-made structure, the brain is the most complex. And each of us have been given one of these brains by God, who created it, who designed it in a beautiful way. The brain is designed to learn best, to operate best, to function best in an atmosphere of joy, an atmosphere of love. So from the time that we are infants, we are looking for joy, and often you'll see a 2-year-old or a 3-year-old. They're looking for your eyes. They want to be enjoyed by you. And when you see them, their face lights up and your face lights up. And as you are enjoying one another, you're amplifying that joy. And the brain loves that. That is what you're designed for. And you can tell on the face of a child, that's what they want. So the brain is designed to function best in relationship with others and in relationship with God. Now, even as I say that your brain was designed by God, it was created, it would not be difficult to find another scientist to stand up here and say, no, it wasn't. I don't agree with that. I think it was just a chance that we have our brains, and we don't owe anything to God. And how someone can have these diametrically opposed opinions, which both are faith, it's very interesting to understand about how the brain works. So, how does your brain decide what is true? Essentially, you decide what you want to believe, and your brain makes it true for you. Neurologically speaking, whatever you immerse yourself in, whatever ideology or worldview you decide you want to believe. And how do you decide what you want to believe? Well, the brain wants to maximize pleasure and minimize pain. So based on those things, and not exactly in that order, actually the brain really first wants to minimize pain. And once there is no more pain, then it will work on maximizing pleasure. So depending on your social group, on your family, on what you were raised with, you can imagine that if you decide to believe something that the people around you don't believe, that would cause you some pain, at least probably some social pain. And so your brain really wouldn't want to believe that. So that is why when someone comes to faith or comes to believe in Jesus as the Messiah from another faith, we're amazed, we're awed, we are impressed, and for good reason. because someone has chosen to go against the brain's judgment that this is going to cause you pain in search of truth. What you decide is truth. So powerful is this decision-making process that the people who flew their planes on 9/11 into those towers believed something. They were not crazy people. They were actually intelligent people. They went to flight school. But they immersed themselves in an ideology to the point that they believed that that was a good thing to do. But what I'm not saying is that anything you decide to believe is true. Dallas Willard has defined reality as what you run into when you're wrong. And as children, especially as teenagers, we bump into a lot of reality. And that is how the brain learns, essentially through painful circumstances. So pain makes us change. It makes us want to not do that again. Let's go to the next slide. So your brain, it's like a garden. What you water, what you feed, what you tend grows. The most valuable thing that you have, the most valuable decisions that you make are where you put your attention, what you choose to focus on. Now, the retail industry and the smartphone industry, they all know how to get your attention and keep it. Many of us don't think about it, but I want to raise it to your attention. Every time you're on the internet and you click on another link to something else, you are making a choice, you're making a decision. And as we become more aware of the decisions that we're making and why we're making them, I don't know if I'm the only one who's gotten on the internet to look for a piece of information, and 30 minutes later, I can't remember what I was looking for, and I'm lost in something right? How does that happen? It's because we just sort of mindlessly clicking, or we start to get a little sleepy, and then our brain wants more stimulation, so we'll follow some more of these trails. So that's a little bit about the brain. As you focus your attention, it's reasonable to imagine that if you decide to focus your attention on entertainment or on movies or on television, these are the things that are going to shape your mind. We know from research that your relationships, that your friendships, the people that you choose to spend time around definitely affect your personality, positively or negatively. What you love, what you pursue, how you choose to spend your time affects how the brain is wiring, what it wants, what it desires. So as we start thinking about prayer, we have to just define it. People would say, okay, well, what is prayer? Well, is it talking to God? Well, some people will say it's not just talking to God, it's actually talking and hearing from God and listening. It's actually relational. The one type of prayer that has been studied more than any other type is a type of prayer called meditation. Next slide, please. Now, many of us are skeptical of meditation because we think that meditation means that we sort of shut our brains off, or we try to think about nothing, and then we're susceptible or vulnerable to whatever force or whatever thought comes in to enter our mind. But that is a type, that is a subset of meditation. most meditation is not like that. And I know all of us in here, I would bet, are very good meditators. How many, let me see a show of hands, how many have worried about anything in the last year or so? So worry is a perfect example of meditation. We are all very good at it. Worry is meditation in a negative sense. It is ruminating, it is going over, it is looking at different angles of that, because the subject of our worry means something to us. And so one of the definitions of meditation is if we can find something that means something to us, can we turn that meditation into a positive, valuable activity? And so the brain scans, the functional MRI scans that you see before you, the top is a non-meditator, someone who doesn't meditate, and after years, basically, 10 years of meditation, they wanted to see if there was any difference in their brains. And they showed some difference, Dr. Newberg and his group in Pennsylvania. They showed there was some difference in the thalamus, that's that arrow in the center of the brain, and also in the frontal lobes, the prefrontal cortex, which is the executive control center of the brain. Essentially, you would say the people that meditate have more control. They are better decision makers. We also know that there are, they've done studies like this with Catholic nuns who are meditating, also with Buddhists, so they've done a number of those. It is difficult to study people who have not done things regularly, consistently, long term. So they're using people who have done this long term. But they also have found occasionally changes in the parietal lobe, which they interpret as meaning that you are no longer self-conscious as you are meditating or praying in the case of the nuns, which they think is a good thing. Now, what you have to understand about this research, or any of the research on the brain, is that when we see changes in the brain like this, nobody knows exactly why. But we call it science to sort of make up why we think those brain colors are changed. It may or may not be. We don't understand exactly why. We can't prove that that is why these have changed, but we can say there are differences in people who meditate. Next slide. So this is a patient with memory loss. They have shown that meditation is very good for Alzheimer's patients. This is meditating 12 minutes a day for 8 weeks. This is a group, only 75% of them actually were able to do it every day. But it showed, again, some difference in the frontal area, the prefrontal cortex, that executive control center, as well as some in the anterior cingulate region, which often is our ability to emotionally regulate, so we don't get so excited or angry or overcome with emotion. Well, meditation is mentioned 18 times in the scriptures. And so I want to make sure that we talk about what meditation looks like for someone who says, I want my brain to change in this area. I want more emotional control. I want to have more peace. I want to have more joy in my life. What good things could I meditate on, and how would that work? Well, I first want to read you a couple of verses. One from Psalm 119, verse 27. Make me understand the way of your precepts. I will meditate on your wondrous works. So to meditate on the wondrous works of God or on the precepts of God is a good thing on which to meditate. Another verse, Psalm 119, 148. My eyes are awake before the watches of the night, that I may meditate on your promise. So meditating on the promises of God. Well, if somebody asked you, can you name one of the promises of God? What would you say? Do you know any? That would be something that you might want to meditate on. Jeremiah 29:11, right? I know the plans I have for you, says the Lord. Plans to prosper you and not to harm you, to give you a future and a hope. So if you took a verse like that and you meditated on it, you looked at it from many different angles, and you did that over time, not just once, you started doing it regularly, that type of meditation will change your brain. It will change your mind as you begin to meditate on words of God that mean something to you. Another verse, another promises of God. Come to me, all who are weary and heavy laden, and I will give you rest. Take my yoke upon you and learn from me, for I am gentle and humble in heart, and you will find rest for your souls. To meditate on a verse like that, on the Lord's Prayer, Our Father who art in heaven, hallowed be thy name. Thy kingdom come, thy will be done, on earth as it is in heaven. So meditating on something, if you find a verse or a promise that means something to you and you're able to meditate on that, that is a very powerful way to change your brain. Meditating on the things that God has done in your life. One of the things that we know is that we all have a negativity bias. If you go to your boss and he tells you your review, 9 things that you did well, but 1 thing that you didn't do so well, what will you focus on as you walk out of the office? We have a negativity bias. Almost everyone, they think it's about 5 to 1. They say in a marriage, it is very important to give 5 compliments before you give any criticism. Mm-hmm. Right? 5 to 1 ratio. They have shown in businesses, if your negativity drops below 3 to 1, 3 nice things that you say to every correction, your business will start going downhill. So this negativity bias is looking for what's going to go wrong. And the negativity bias is also involved in what I'll call the default state of the mind. And I'd say it's important for you to understand the default state of your mind, which is what you think about when you're not really thinking about anything at all. So the first thing that we know that we all think about is called self-referential processing. Essentially, not how I think I appear or how others think I appear, but what I think others think I look like. Mm-hmm. We're constantly interested in how we are being seen. And also, that's part of it is what I deserve. Maybe somebody came in and they thought, well, I really deserve my own parking space, or I deserve better at my job, or I deserve a raise, or whatever we think we deserve. So we're always self-referentially processing that. It's a little hot outside. Oh, it's a little cool in here. We're always thinking about how other people view us and sort of a social a commentary that's running in our minds. Second thing we think about is called social cognition. Comparing ourselves with others. Oh, that person in front of me has such nice hair and I'm losing mine. Or what you're driving in your car and someone passes you in a new Jaguar and you're like, oh, look at that. And I've got this thing. Constant comparisons. Generally focusing on how we don't measure up. And the third thing that we think about is called time travel. We all go backwards and forwards, looking at the regrets of the past, things that we wish we'd have done, and then every now and then we'll travel forward. Oh, something's coming up, and I'm worried about such and such, or what about the economy, or things are going to crash. Typically, with a negativity bias, we're doing our time travel. So that is what our default state looks like. And to escape that, most of us use our smartphones, because as soon as you start to focus, it seems to get better. Because it actually, from the literature, from the research, it looks like torment that most of us generally live in, with all of this negativity bombarding us. And there are a couple of ways to help that default state. One is to focus. And so we turn music on, we watch TV, we try to get something going to help us focus. Medication helps. Alcohol, drugs, one of the reasons so many are addicted is because we're trying to quiet this default state of our mind, which is tormenting us. By the way, we know that in depression, even when people who are depressed try to focus, they cannot shut off the default state. It continues bombarding them with negativity. But the other thing that helps the default state is prayer, is meditating, is focusing, and also is relationships. And so when we look at prayer as not just this meditational type of prayer, there are numbers of different types of prayer, and maybe we'll discuss some of those tonight. But we're not able scientifically to prove that I call it a flare prayer, help God, as we shoot those things up, which I do occasionally in surgery, and you do, when you just narrowly missed a car. We can't pick those up on the scans. The only thing we can pick up is something that people do for enough time that the brain has time to actually change its wiring. And we have what's called plasticity in the brain, so it does want to change the wire. It will change with regular use. Just like you will change when you fall in love, you will become more like that person, that your brain will start to morph. It will change for better or for worse, depending on the object of your love. And so as we're praying, as we're talking and listening to God, we are able to change our brains and our minds, especially if it's an engaging, joyful time. And so what we think about God becomes one of the most important things in our life. How we view God. Is God angry? Is he critical? Is he distant? Is he demanding? Is he like your father? Because probably 90% of people had a father or a mother who did not represent God well to them, who was not treating them with unconditional love and blessing them and being kind, and grace was just flowing from them, saying, oh, get up and try again. Many of us had a lot of criticism. And so our brains have wired to that authority figure. So when we even think about God, we are praying to or talking with someone who's in our imagination that matches what our brains have already wired to. And so those of us who have had critical, harsh, angry parents are going to need to do some extra work to unwind that in order to get a positive relationship going so that the prayer is actually functioning to build you up and to make you, more peaceful or more joyful. And with that, we'll probably take some questions now.
Thank you. Yeah. Would you please join me in thanking Dr. Levy for his presentation with a mind like his and his ability to deduce it down to how I can understand it, because he could turn on the hose and really give us lots of information that would be so detailed. If we were in his line of work, we would perhaps understand it. So thank you for making that. I love this concept about, this but I'm not sure I like them, but the self-referential processing, and then we have the social cognition, and then the default state. And then you were talking about how the brain is wired to the authority figure. Could we start there? I know we have several questions here this evening. Could we start with the development of the brain? So a little child, as that child is developing, and you initially spoke of how we gain this eye contact, and that there's something wonderful, maybe even mysterious and beautiful about this connection. And we know in developmental theory that oftentimes that's giving empathy to the child. The child is building their ego mass strength. They're feeling good about themselves. But what is happening in the brain when the brain begins to be wired to an authority figure?
It depends on the type of authority figure, because the brain responds to, a couple of large emotions, but shame is obviously necessary in life, because if you are, coloring on the wall, or have your hand in your diaper and whatever, there's a certain amount of shame that the parent comes out with that makes the child understand that this is, not a good idea. Or because what shame is saying, I'm not pleased with you. And of course, a child is always looking for what is pleasing. In fact, one of the dangers is that anyone who shows attention to a child will bond with that child. And so the parent who is shaming, now shame is useful, but it's useful for about a minute, 30 seconds. And then it's very important to come back with, no, but I am still glad to be with you, because shame is telling them, I don't want to be with you right now. And so essentially, as a parent representing the image of God, we want to be able to say, but that's not good for you. That will not put you in a good place later in life, but I'm still here with you. And I can handle your tantrum, your mess, and I can help you clean that up. Let's do this together. So shame for short order is healthy. Most of us, unfortunately, experience shame for hours, sometimes days, sometimes weeks before the parent would even speak to us again. So essentially we learn, I am shameful. There's something shameful about me. It's not that I did something shameful, it's that I am shameful, which is a very powerful tool for parents, because it gets a response. It gets, often behaviorally, it gets what you want, which is controlling the child, but it sows some bad seed and later on comes out. So people who are shamed often end up in addiction.
Yes. Because
addiction sort of helps with all that shame, and then which causes more shame. And so, when you feel bad, you default to more shame. So, that's one type of parenting. Anger is something else that really is hard for children, actually for any of us. We have in the brain what's called mirror neurons. So I'm going to mimic, if I see Don smiling, I'm going to smile. If I see you smiling, I'm going to smile. If you are in your brain even mimicking some of my energy or my expressions, that's just how we're wired. And so if I'm regularly watching news programs with angry people, with fearful people, with people who are trying to stir this up, that is actually going to start changing my brain. And we know that when we end up angry, you actually shut off the part of the brain that is logical, and you also shuts off the part of the brain that even understands how illogical you might be sounding. So there's a lot of things that happen with anger. First of all, the blood flow is taken away from these frontal lobes, the executive control center, the part that needs to make a decision. Like, I think maybe, I need to take a few breaths and back up here. Well, which is actually one of the treatments for anger, is to start breathing more deeply, because that switches you from this sympathetic system to the parasympathetic, or the relaxing system. So anger also. So anger, we mentioned anger, and shame as far as shaping the brain of children.
So you're suggesting that if a child takes that shame and begins to believe they are shameful rather than their behavior being unacceptable, that then changes the brain.
It does. And it's not just children. I mean, obviously, it happens in our relationships. It happens between husband and wife. I mean, what's a cold shoulder? What's a pout? right? This is shame. You have offended me to the point that I am no longer glad to be with you, and you need to be uncomfortable. I will punish you. You need to be uncomfortable around me until I feel like giving you some grace. And instead of talking it out or saying, look, you've hurt me, just give me a little time, and encouraging the person that has made the mistake. They know they've made it. We all know when we make mistakes. To identify it and then say, but this is how we're going to move forward. Look, we're going to talk about it tomorrow. We're going to talk about it in a little bit. But right now, I just need a minute. You know when you're not in a good place to have a conversation with somebody because your brain is too wound up. You've already released all these stress chemicals into your system, which have already taken the blood flow away from your frontal lobes, and you're into your anger, your stress, your fear. The things that they've said have just triggered you, and you need some time away. So you can shame them. You can go out and slam the door, or you can say, I need some time right now, and then you can, get away as you need to. I mean, you need to be kind to yourself as well. But the way that we shame our family members or the people closest to us, I think also is patterns that we have learned and wired to and need to unlearn and unwire. And some of the prayer techniques can certainly help with that.
So let's talk for just a moment about God and shame. Let's look at that for just a moment. In the Bible, we know that God is always moving toward us in love, agape love. He loves us to the point of sacrificing himself through Christ, the incarnation of God himself. So he's always moving toward us in love. Do you think he ever moves to a place of shaming us? And then we're going to reflect back to a marriage like you just talked about. What are your thoughts about that with the brain? With this idea of shame, it's such a critical issue. I see it every day in my practice.
Oh, we love shame. I mean, shame, what are tabloids? That's nothing but shame.
Yes.
We are drawn to it. It is what we respond to it. And so, yes, we're very tuned into any kind of shame. And certainly in the Bible, there's plenty of shame examples of things that people should have done or God wishes they would have done. But he's always longing that people will repent, will realize, and will essentially change. Repent, the word is to change the way you think, change the way that you're thinking about something. And so a lot of this, and unfortunately, the way we change, I didn't mention the one time when you have this worldview, the one time that the brain is open to change, because most of the time when you have a worldview, as long as things are going well for you, there is no reason to change. You've got a teenager who's, taking drugs, life is good, has a fast car. They're not open to change. Life is going well. They will not change until they hit reality. Their girlfriend drops them, they end up in jail, they lose the car. Something shocks them, and pain now, all of a sudden, the left brain, which is kind of this library, says, we don't have the information that we thought we did. We're open to some new information now. I'm ready to take on a little new information. I wonder if anyone has any. And so this is when your teenager would be open. Or
does this actually happen with teenagers? Do you say they opened up that side of their brain?
Or maybe a friend of yours or someone. We're all open to when life is not working the way we thought it should be. And then also we're also open to spiritual things at that point. We're more interested if God, could he be near to us? And one of the things that many of us don't realize is that God is tender when he sees weakness.
Yes.
He's not critical. He's not harsh.
Yes.
He's tender toward weakness. And so when you pray, and prayer is not always just speaking. I mean, I oftentimes will journal. I will write my prayers because it is harder for me to focus. And so as you're writing your prayers, I also have to take time out. I take a Sabbath. So I will pick a 24-hour period. It is usually for me Friday night to Saturday night, the initial Sabbath, because often Sundays are busy. But I will shut off my electronics for 24 hours. And I've been doing it now for years, and I can tell you it gets a little bit easier, but not that much. I still walk by my computer and I start to twitch, like, I surely should check my email. Maybe it's something. It's because we've started getting our stimulation, our dopamine in the brain. We love stimulation. But like a 2-year-old who doesn't want to go to bed and thinks they need to stay up and watch more television because they need more. Your brain says, more stimulation is the answer, but the answer is less stimulation. But it is hard to give up these addictions of that ding on the telephone, that somebody might need me, that somebody's trying to reach me, and so I shut the ringer off, no email. And I essentially fast from electronics for 24 hours. And that sort of resets, I will say it resets my joy meter. Because most of us, to have joy or stimulation, we need a YouTube video or some excitement or a phone call from a friend. And we've forgotten that a smile or a flower or something, the simple things, could be very, very enjoyable. But we have to reset our threshold. And I believe that God designed the Sabbath. He designed our bodies and our brains to take a 24-hour break. Now, for most people, that's just way too much. So I say, start with 4 hours. Try to take the morning. Start with the kids would, sort of without their cell phone. They've actually described a new neurological condition when girls lose their cell phones. They actually have panic attacks and things like this. It is people become so attached to these things that they're addicted, but we don't like to admit how addicted we are.
Is that called sober living?
Sober living.
I have my university students, I'll ask them, each year I do, and I'll say, how many of you have had a phantom text? And they look at me like they do as a prof sometimes, like, what? And I'll ask it in. A phantom text. I mean, you think someone's texting you, but they're really not. All the hands go up. They do. And it's that issue. And then they lose sometimes that mirroring neuron, which actually produces, does it not, an issue of empathy in relationship. Isn't that if I smile like you said, and you smiled back, there's a reciprocity engagement process. Let me shift, if I can, to this question from the audience here, and that is, it's related to trauma. Is trauma from emotional damage visible in the brain? And I think you would clearly describe that. And can it heal thoroughly? That's quite a question. It's a dual question here. Is trauma from emotional damage visible in the brain, or on the brain is how they say it, and can it heal thoroughly?
Well, good question. So the short answer is no. You cannot see emotional trauma like, oh, there it is. Because the brain is so complex with so many interconnections. You can see, what you will see oftentimes is a very busy brain. This default state will be enhanced because trauma typically causes stress as we review that. We review what happened, and then if we get into bitterness and anger about who caused that, now we've started into ruminating on this person and what they need to do to pay me back. Or in many cases, some of us, the person has already died, but we can't let that go. I would say that bitterness and resentment, one of the most critical parts for physical healing that we are able to forgive. And that is, powerful part. But the brain gets busy. We see that. The second part of the question, can we heal from emotional trauma? I believe the answer to that is yes. I don't believe that it is necessarily quickly. It's different for different people. But unwinding that, I think, and some of it is getting to the point of forgiveness. Because identity, whenever we have emotional trauma, our identity has been damaged or We've been treated in a disrespectful way. And that makes us feel, especially if it happened during our childhood, and now it's been repeated in adulthood, like in a relationship. We were treated that way by our parents, and now we've gone through a divorce or something that's been traumatic. Well, now we can be very, very angry at the person that caused this. But it really started way back. And, tracing it back and looking back, I know I've done some work recently just looking back at my parents. I had a problem forgiving my father for many years. And, in fact, he wrote some memoirs of his life, and I read through them, and they sounded like just excuses. But I went through them recently, and I think sometimes forgiveness does occur in layers. And I've realized that I would just, now as I read his childhood, the word I would use to describe it is bleak. Like he didn't get anything. He wasn't loved. He was raised during wartime in a Jewish family that was, kicked out of their country. His parents both were from single parent homes, and so they were poor and didn't have resources, and they got married, and so there was nothing that he got that he could give to me. And so sometimes as we look back at our parents and we start to develop compassion for them, like they're just like us, trying to do the best they could. And yeah, we have more information now. We have talks like this, and My Therapist Sez we can learn about the brain, but that generation did not. And so as we develop compassion for them, and certainly the fifth commandment, honor your father and mother that it may go well with you, that you may enjoy a long life on the earth. Something about as we give grace to our parents, it comes back to us. And so some of healing from emotional trauma does have to do with going back to our parents. And I will add that if you are unable to forgive your parents, it's unlikely that you can have a joyful relationship with your Heavenly Father. It's possible, perhaps, but it's certainly much more difficult. And I would say probably not possible. So, one of the things I like to ask is, was I a son to my father like Jesus was a son to his father? The answer, of course, for me is no. I was absolutely not interested at all in what my father wanted. I was off on my own. I wanted what I wanted. And most of us, that's the same story. Our parents are there to give to us while we're off, doing whatever, and you're just supposed to support me. But Jesus was interested in what his father wanted. I was not. And so some of us are looking at our parents to say, you really messed up. And some of the most healing, forgiveness I think is the first part, but confession is even more powerful to say, I was not a son or a daughter to my father or mother, the way Jesus was a son to his father. That is powerfully healing. I believe it's a process.
Yes.
And the more we have compassion on others, I think that the compassionate brain, and this really reflects on prayer, we become like the God we worship.
Yes.
We become like the God we worship. And if your God is angry or reminds you of your father or your mother or whoever, usually it's whichever parent was the worst, that we choose that parent and that's our model for God. You are working from a tough brain wiring, and it's going to take you a little bit longer to believe that God is good. Because as soon as something goes bad, you're going to throw up your hands and say, well, there you go. I'm on my own. He's abandoned me.
Yes.
And so it's very difficult then to connect with God when you feel bad, especially if you were punished harshly, or, sometimes I'd even say time out is, go to your room, and when you've sorted yourself out, then you can come back. I'm not sure God treats us that way. He basically says, sounds like you've got a problem. I'm here with you. You need some help? Be glad to help you with that. And that is not how most of us were treated. And so what we don't do is when we start feeling this stress response, our heart starting to pound, someone has just offended us or cut you off in traffic or, whatever has happened, this pattern, you start feeling the stress response, which I believe God gave us because it's your signal to pray. It's your signal that God gave you to pray. You are about to lose control. And it's happened before, so be a good time to pray, to take a deep breath. We talk all about science, about why we have all this stress, and it's from when we were chased by saber-toothed tigers. No, I believe it's because God says something meaningful has just happened to you, and your response to something meaningful can go a couple of ways. You can respond in a fear, like, oh no, I'm losing this. Or you can say, oh, this is a challenge. I actually enjoy, in some sense, coming into the office, and the receptionist will say, oh, or the nurse who puts the patient in, oh, we've got an angry patient today. And because it's a challenge to me, I kind of rise to the challenge. How am I going to diffuse this situation? But also you have to know, to be able to rise to the challenge, that you have the resources, or between you and God, between the two of you, you have the resources to handle this. Because it is a myth that somebody quoted that, God says that he never gives us more than we can handle. I don't think that's first of all, it's not in the Bible. I don't think it's true. I think he every story in the Bible basically is saying it's much more than the person could handle. You're going to need some help with this, and that is why your Heavenly Father says, oh, you need some help? What would you like? Because I hear a lot of complaining and whining coming out of your mouth, but what do you want? Because many times I'm stuck and angry, and I've not actually prayed about, well, Lord, this is what I want. Or sometimes I'm offended with somebody, or I'm offended that I've lost a relationship, but I want that person to give me the respect back, instead of saying, Lord, I forgive them, but I would like another relationship. You can send me someone else. That's okay with me. That is a form of forgiveness, of reframing your problems. And I think so much of when we get into prayer, we know what we want, but because of circumstances, we're not going to get what we want. To be able to reframe, saying, God, what might you be doing in my life with this physical illness that I've prayed about and it's still here, with my finances, with my relationship, with this unrest? What are you doing in our relationship? Because essentially everything for God is relational. Yes, he wants you to be happy, yes. But all of the patriarchs in the Bible, they all had a famine in their lifetime. And a famine means you basically lose everything and have to go somewhere else, which stressed them out. We find them lying and doing a number of things. They were stressed. And God loves that period, because now instead of having, all the wealth around them, now they have to start relying on him, and he loves relationship.
So that fear, the fear, oftentimes that you talked about, the sympathetic system can engage, and now all of a sudden I'm really engaging my limbic system of fear, wanting to fight, flight, freeze, these common statements that we'll make, and then it takes the parasympathetic part of the nervous system to lower that. But fear causes us to move toward anger, which means that we would not necessarily accept God's grace. God's grace is there. He's always pursuing us. I think you were suggesting that. Yeah. And that is turning to him. That's what I'm hearing you say. Yeah. As simple as that sounds, it can be very difficult as a human, because we have perception of what we think is reality and what we believe God is having us do or be, rather than seeking His divine direction for our life. May I switch us to something about trauma? The question that one of the audience members has suggested is cognitive processing therapy, it's actually CBT, cognitive behavioral therapy, is CBT used to treat war veterans with PTSD, that's post-traumatic stress disorder? And is that similar to your topic? I think it's a great question. We've all heard of, PTSD and how people can be traumatized, not just on the war front, but yet that's a very common experience. And then how is it treated?
Sure.
Cognitive behavioral therapy, and this is something we can talk back and forth, but
Sure.
What are your thoughts about that? Dr. Levy?
Well, I think cognitive behavioral therapy is probably helpful initially. I know that for PTSD, oftentimes other modalities are necessary.
So, for example, EMDR treatment,
Exactly.
which is actually a reprocessing of the brain versus just processing, which Dr. Aaron Beck and cognitive behavioral therapy would suggest. Perhaps even the combination thereof, those two treatments?
Yep. One of the things that I think many of us go through periods where we have a little post-traumatic stress. We've had a lot of adrenaline over a certain issue, and we just feel a little tired or a little blue. It's a little tougher to think. Our thoughts are coming more slowly. We find we react more quickly in a negative fashion. Many of us don't realize that for instance, traffic takes concentration and focus and energy from you. So if you're driving in traffic, by the time you get home, you have less self-control than you had when you started. And many of us don't realize that if you've had a long day, you've had to confront some people over some things, taking self-control from you, that self-control itself is a depletable resource. And so to be cognizant of when you might be low in your self-control, and I notice that if I'm get a little irritated easily, that I need to be something's wrong and I don't know what. I have not attributed what has stolen my self-control. And so to find that, and then even if I can't identify it, to say, well, I've had for whatever reason, I need to be kind to myself now, not angry. But when we gratitude is another thing I want to mention as far as PTSD. That's very, very helpful because as you have post-traumatic stress, you are reviewing that event, going over and over it, and it is a negative event, and it does shape the brain. In fact, it shrinks the brain. We have seen that PTSD will actually shrink your brain. That all of these chemicals and all of this rumination is very bad. Gratitude, on the other hand, if you can focus on gratitude, it's helpful. But it's not easy because our brains have a negativity bias. And so, you may be enjoying yourself tonight, but you're not even thinking about it. You might be wondering, I've got to get home and something else. You might have had a nice day today, but the good things we let go so quickly. Maybe 1 or 2 seconds, we'll just briefly think about them. And they say that if you can hold a positive emotion for 10 to 12 seconds, that's actually quite a long time. When typically we hold negative things and ruminate on those easily for 12 seconds, but something positive we let go in 1 or 2 seconds. And if you have that kind of trauma, if you can start training your brain to recognize that there are good things about your life and start giving thanks to God and developing, the one thing that develops relationship when it's difficult is appreciation. So if you're having trouble connecting with God, appreciation of, sometimes even the small things. I recommend what I call a gratitude grab sometimes, and that means say as many things as you can think of that you're thankful for, such that if you didn't mention them, you might not have them tomorrow. Right? It sort of raises the stakes. Now all of a sudden you're going to be thankful for things you've been taking for granted. If you don't mention it, that tomorrow you might not have those things. And so it gets you into a different frame of mind, like, wow, there's a lot of things that I can be thankful for. And then as you mention them, try to think about that for 10 seconds and go through that list very powerful positively for the brain. Because appreciation and gratitude are very, very good for the brain and brain chemistry and brain healing.
Yes, I love the illustration of the little boy he would throw the ball up and miss it, and say, I'm the best batter in the world, and he'd throw it up again and miss it. I'm the best. You've heard the story, perhaps the batter in the world, and he'd throw it up, and then he took the ball and then he just threw it out in the outfield and said, I'm the best pitcher in the world. So he kept talking to himself, regardless of what was happening. He was his own best cheerleader. So when you think about these, this is just a fabulous, what you're sharing is so practical and so helpful. This next question from an audience member is, can brain imaging reveal the chemical imbalance? I know you just talked about that with post-traumatic stress, where there's a shrinkage. Is that in the thalamus, oftentimes, the hypothalamus, and in that area of the limbic system where we can see that? It's
actually some is in the hippocampus, which is the memory area. Mm-hmm. So difficult, which if you think about it, a lot of people will come to me in the office and say, I'm losing my memory. And my first question is, how is your stress level? Because stress, all that cortisol, is designed in a stressful situation for you not to really remember the trauma. So you're secreting all this cortisol, which is sort of, wiping your memories clean, and you're having trouble remembering where you put your keys, and you think you're losing your mind, but it's probably the stress in your life. And many of us deal with a level of stress that we consider normal. And that's just the way it is. And, taking a Sabbath is where I discover my stress, where it's coming from. I'll start writing, or I'll have enough quiet that I'm able to realize, wow, that was stressful to be at that function, at that event, that surgery. I didn't realize what that interaction with this patient or person or colleague took out of me, or a family member having a problem, how that's weighing on your heart. People who you love, who are angry with God, or who are having, whatever difficult situation. Those are hard for you to deal with, or to deal with quickly, and they need some time to process with God. So, taking the time, starting with gratitude, building that connection with God, and then writing. And even if you're angry, it's fine. The Psalms are full of anger and lament, and all of these things. It's an honest appreciation for, God, this is not the way that I would do it. I'm going to reframe this. Obviously, I'm going to do this with respect. You're teaching me something, but I'm having a hard time with my circumstances. And here's an interesting thing to add. Father, can you understand how I feel? See, many of us think that God doesn't understand how we feel. He's just upset with our behavior. Mm-hmm. And I think one of the main reasons that Jesus comes down and experiences all of these emotions, especially things like rejection. Do you understand what it's like when people reject me? Oh, yeah. Oh, Jesus knows all about. How about betrayal? Any ideas about betrayal? Oh, yeah. God knows all about betrayal. Spending 3 years with somebody, giving and giving and giving, and having them, sell you out for some money or position. Ouch. Oh, yeah. Yeah, he understands at a very deep and personal level about betrayal. So when you say, Father, do you understand how I'm feeling right now? And then, put your journal there and wait and listen for the answer. Mm-hmm. Give him some time to talk. Do you understand what it's like to lose friends? Do you understand what it's like to have, financial problems? Most of us just turn it into, okay, I've got a prayer list and I'm going through this list of prayer. I'm not sure that necessarily changes your brain, but relationships do change your brain. And being understood and affirmed, that type of relationship changes your brain. And so being able to interact with God as someone who cares. But this this is the other thing, to be able to interact enough with consistency and with time so that God becomes neurologically real for you. One of the things that's really not talked about much is it is more difficult to have a relationship with someone you can't see than someone that you can see. I can look into your eyes, I can see your expression, I can understand. And so, we all talk about relationship with God as if we're supposed to be, it's really easy. It's getting harder and harder because we're so stimulated by our electronics. To feel anything, to sense what is He thinking about? And so to be able to sit to write, God, what are you thinking about this problem that I'm facing? What strikes you? What about my fear? What about how I'm feeling? Do you understand? Interacting with that. Very important to give God. I talk to God in my car, right? I'll reach over and I'll pat the seat like I'm patting him on the leg or something. When I do things that allow God to be neurologically real for me. I'm a very logical person. Some people feel God's presence moving in and out. I generally don't. But I do things. I get up in the morning and I'll set a chair in front of me and I'll talk to God that way. I do things that help my mind engage that God is a person. He's not a human person, but he's a person with a personality. You mentioned the Psalms. Singing is excellent for the brain. Absolutely excellent. And the music that you listen to, very important. The lyrics have shown to be very, very important to the development of the brain. But singing praises to God, when I really don't feel like I can connect, I will sing. And I've got a little piano and I play a few chords and I will write some I wouldn't call them songs, I'll call them jingles, but some little things that are my personal psalms, the things that I sing when I need to pull myself out of some real difficulty because I'm having trouble believing that God is with me. Because people will abandon us, and it feels like God has abandoned us because we are so tied in socially to people. Our brain is created that way. We are social beings. But to sing to God, to come to Him with thanksgiving and praise really helps connect. Very, very healing for me.
Thank you. This was absolutely sterling, exceptional with Dr. Levy. Would you join me in thanking this marvelous man and his skill and ability?
Thank you.